that it is a hardship.
And Tricia, we appreciate you calling in and giving us your input this morning on the topic. That's it for this edition of Washington Journal. Another comes your way at 7 o'clock tomorrow. We now go to the House of Representatives.
The House will be in order. The chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., October 9th, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Chris Collins to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the two parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chairman recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, try and leave this world a little better than you found it. Those were the parting words of Robert Baden-Powell, a soldier, writer, and founder of the World Scouting Movement. This was a message to all Scouts that was found among his papers after Powell's passing in 1941. I'm a Scouter, Mr. Speaker. It's part of who I am, both as an American and an elected official proudly representing Pennsylvania's 5th Congressional District. Scouter Powell's words today are part of Scouting's principles, to always leave the campsite cleaner than when you found it. It's about service, serving others, and making the world a better place. They also ring true in the debate now taking place in Washington. Today, we are saddling future generations with mountains of debt. We've made promises we cannot keep. We're leaving the next generation worse off than our own. We face a nation with grave challenges, challenges that aren't being addressed. The fact of the matter is that Congress has yet to deal with the real drivers of our debt, a large portion of which is health care costs. Mr. Speaker, I don't care who won the White House or which party holds majority in Congress. Why? Because not until we actually tackle the tough issues, the tough challenges, can we honestly say that Congress or the White House is doing what's right for the country. Right now, we aren't making necessary progress. Not on our budget and deficits, not on our long-term debt, not on bringing down the cost of health care. Though we have made some progress on spending, we are nowhere near where we need to be. We're also leaving the health system worse than when we found it. Here are just 2 letters from my constituents that my office has received. Tina from Jefferson County, Pennsylvania writes, and I quote, "Please do not vote in any way to continue funding the Affordable Care Act. It in no way improves the situation of the average American. Yes, it provides another option for health insurance, but the rates are no more affordable than the private insurances, and therefore if a person cannot afford the private insurance, there's no way they'll be able to afford the government plan. In addition, the Act places further strain on the system and will cause the shutdown of more hospitals, cause more physicians to leave the system, and further crowd our nation's emergency departments," end quote. Catherine from Du Bois, who wrote, quote, "I am fortunate to have good insurance through my employer. However, I found out from them that they may provide a lesser form of health care due to the No Cadillac plan. They understandably want to avoid penalty for providing a good plan. This seems unfair to me, as if we're being penalized for working and having a good employer. If they are willing to provide a good health plan, why should they be penalized, and why should they have to lessen our coverage? I'm very distraught about many of the layers of the health care plan that are starting to come to light. I don't know if anything can be done," end quote. Well, I cannot stand idle as Congress acts like it's solving problems when, in fact, it's failing to tackle the tough issues, health being one of them. Let me be clear that a government shutdown is unacceptable. However, each day we stall and fail to deal with these challenges, the worse it gets for the next generation. The real debate needs to be about how do we get our fiscal house in order and set a course of long-term debt, long-term job growth. Not until then will I be satisfied. It should be about addressing the challenges the people elected us to solve. Again, not until then will I be satisfied. It's about trying to leave this world a little better than what we found it. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous speaker said that the shutdown should be unacceptable. I agree with that. And we could all, within the next half an hour, vote to make the unacceptable not the policy that we are pursuing. Mr. Speaker, our government has now been shut down for over a week, and the American people are looking to Congress for solutions, not spin. Thousands of dedicated federal employees here, but more profusely around this country, continue to be furloughed without pay, all because a faction of Republicans insist on keeping government closed until we repeal the Affordable Care Act, a demand that has nothing to do with keeping our government open. Debate about the Affordable Care Act is legitimate. There are people who disagree with it and people who agree with it. But holding ransom the people's government is and should be, as the previous speaker said, unacceptable. Americans are tired. I'm tired. I think most members are tired of hearing the same rhetoric from politicians over and over. Instead, they want real solutions that can restore fiscal sanity, end the irrational sequester, which Hal Rogers, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, conservative Republican from Kentucky, says does not work and cannot work, and break the cycle of manufactured crises that do nothing to help our economy and, in fact, are doing it great harm. So the question, Mr. Speaker, we must ask ourselves is, how do we reach a solution? How can this Congress achieve the big, balanced deal that our constituents expect from us? First and foremost, we must end the shutdown. Mr. Speaker, 200 Democrats, we have a vacancy, 200 Democrats will vote this very day, this very hour, to open the government. That means, Mr. Speaker, we only need 18 Republicans. This previous speaker said it's unacceptable where we are. We can change it, and we can change it within the hour. With only 18 Republicans joining 200 Democrats to say, let the people's government be open. Let the people's government be serving them. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, we must end this shutdown and take action to prevent the United States from defaulting on its bills for the first time in history. A solvent nation should not be taken hostage to accomplish an objective. Once these immediate threats are removed, Congress should then vote to go to conference on the differences, which are legitimate, between our two budgets. Republicans have refused for the last 6 months in the House and in the Senate to go to conference. The Speaker talks about negotiation. That is where you do it. That is the mechanism that is set up under our democracy to resolve differences. Go to conference. There, we can have the opportunity to agree on a comprehensive, balanced plan to put our country on a fiscally sustainable path, not for the next week, the next month, the next 180 days, but for decades to come. And if we do that, our economy will explode, jobs will be created, and Americans will again feel good, not only about their country, but about their Congress. The shutdown and the threat of default are standing in the way of a real negotiation process for a long-term solution. Democrats, I say, Mr. Speaker, are ready to sit down and talk with our Republican colleagues about a long-term agreement. We know that will require tough decisions, but Republicans should not demand their own policies as ransom required to reopen the government and make sure America pays its bills. Democrats have already made the difficult choice to accept the Republicans' preferred budget level for the short-term funding bill. How do I know it's their preferred funding bill? Because they voted on it and sent it to the Senate, Mr. Speaker. And the Senate said, we will accept your number. And they sent it back here, and my Republican colleagues will not say yes to their own number. A big and balanced agreement on a budget. After we take the Republican number to open up government, go to conference, have discussions, a big and balanced agreement on the budget and on getting our debt under control will require real compromise and difficult decisions. My colleagues, we should have the wisdom and, yes, the courage to make them. And if we do, future generations will thank us. I continue to believe, Mr. Speaker, that there is a bipartisan majority of members in this House who are ready to work in good faith towards achieving such an agreement. My observation, however, is after 33 years in this body that there is a small faction on the Republican side of the aisle, it may be 50, it may be 60, that is holding captive the 170 of their colleagues who want to make sense and move forward. I hope that the Speaker Boehner will take the important steps necessary to enable those negotiations to begin by allowing a vote on the Senate's bill at the House number to reopen government and another one on a clean measure to prevent an unthinkable and economically catastrophic default. Once those occur, Mr. Speaker, we'll be able to resume work on achieving real and lasting results for the American people when it comes to our long-term fiscal health. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Cantor, I would hope that the Majority Leader, Mr. Speaker, would bring the bill to open our government, the people's government, to the floor this day, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this October fiscal crisis is punctuated by 3 developments that are becoming increasingly obvious and disturbing. The first is the refusal of the Senate and the President to resolve their differences with the House through negotiation and compromise on the bill that would actually fund the government and end this shutdown. In recent days, senior administration officials have said they don't care how long the shutdown lasts because they're winning politically, and that the President would rather the nation default than negotiate with the House. Our form of government cannot operate in such a manner. Congress is a bicameral legislature. That means 2 houses that are specifically designed to have a different perspective on issues. The 2 houses of Congress were designed to disagree. The only way a bicameral legislature can possibly function is through each house exercising its own best judgment on a given issue and then coming together and meeting to isolate their differences and resolve them through negotiation and compromise. The conference process of Congress has evolved over centuries. It's very effective at resolving the differences between the 2 houses, but it takes 2 houses to operate it, and the Senate is refusing to do so. This malfunction is at the very heart of our stalemate. The second development is the deliberate decision by the administration to amplify the public's suffering and inconvenience during this stalemate. This government's gone through 18 shutdowns now in the past 37 years, but never has a president barricaded open-air venues like national memorials. In fact, he's gone so far as to forbid the use of turnouts on public roads that offer passers-by distant views of Mount Rushmore and Yosemite. He's ordered people out of their own homes and ordered businesses to close just because they lease land from the federal government. He's even tried to close the Atlantic Ocean to Florida fishermen. In the past, presidents have done everything they could to minimize the impacts of shutdowns. This president is going to ridiculous extremes to maximize the suffering that people must endure. One park ranger told a reporter, quote, "We've been told to make life as difficult for people as we can," end quote. And then he added, "It's disgusting." And when this House has passed stopgap measures to minimize these impacts, the President and the Senate have summarily rejected them. The third development is the rapid unraveling of Obamacare. As it is rolled out, millions of Americans have discovered that their health insurance rates have skyrocketed, or they are losing their health plans entirely, or that they're having their hours cut back at work. It's very clear that the public isn't buying these new government-brokered policies. 170,000 people visited the Maryland Exchange looking for affordable insurance since it opened more than a week ago, but only 326 have actually bought these plans, less than 2%. Now imagine, you've got the biggest store in town, people are required by law to purchase your product, you open for business, and 99.8% of the customers who walk into your store walk out again without buying your product. Do you think you have a problem? We can't pretend this isn't happening. Millions of Americans right now are losing their health plans and not finding affordable replacements. This matter must be resolved, and it must be resolved now. This government only exists with the consent of the governed. When it deliberately goes out of its way to maximize the pain and suffering of the American people in this crisis, it jeopardizes that consent. This matter must be resolved, and it must be resolved now. And this government is simply not designed to function with one party refusing to talk to the other, with one House refusing to resolve the differences that divide it from the other. This simple failure is at the heart of our nation's distress, and it too must be resolved, and it must be resolved now. We're now 5 years into this administration. They have not been happy ones for our nation. But now we've arrived at a crisis, or more precisely at 3 crises. One that's costing millions of Americans the health plans they liked and were told they could keep, a second in the relationship of this government to the people, and a third in the basic function of our fundamental constitutions. Happily, the Constitution's framers gave us all of the tools that are necessary to resolve these crises, except for one, and that one is what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. Only we can appeal to those angels, and we must do so before more harm befalls our country. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today is the 9th day of the Republican shutdown. What started as a tantrum against the Affordable Care Act to defund it, then morphed into a demand to delay it for a year, but now it's really an open assault on our system of government. Unless a fanatic minority holding John Boehner and the American people hostage get their way, they will continue to inflict unnecessary pain on hundreds of thousands of our employees and on the American public. Now they are poised to wreck the global economy by threatening that America will not pay its bills. If it works, they will do it all over again. Make no mistake, this is an assault on our system of government unlike anything we've seen before. We must stop them now, united in the belief that there are some lines we're not going to cross. There will be no weapons on the floor of the House and no willful damage to the American people. What if these fanatics had their tactics used against them? What if Democrats and Speaker Pelosi demanded that the disastrous war in Iraq stop? And if it didn't, we would wreck the American economy. That our deeply felt concerns about preparing for climate change and global warming were non-negotiable. What if Senator Chris Murphy, who had 26 innocent children and their teachers massacred in his district, what if he said, enough? Unless we get background checks for purchasers of guns to make sure that unfit people can't get them, something that 90% of the American people agree with. Unless I get that, I'm going to shut down the government. Can you imagine the howls of outrage? There's a tremendous disconnect here. One glaring symbol of the disconnect can be found in the sub-basement of the Rayburn office building, the House Gym. Now, make no mistake, everywhere I've worked, I've started fitness programs for all our employees. They save money, they improve productivity, they can even save lives. I helped start a fitness program for our employees here on Capitol Hill. If anything, it may be more important for people in Congress who are leading a crazy, unhealthy lifestyle and can seldom get together and interact like human beings. For 17 years, this is where I've tried to start every single day, to exercise, to enjoy bipartisan camaraderie, an island in the storm of Capitol Hill. It's convenient to be able to shower there instead of at home. It's important. It's very important. But it's not essential. You know, I had somebody argue with me yesterday that it doesn't cost that much because we pay dues. We have an access key that lets us in, and there aren't any staff members there now. Well, that's true. It doesn't cost very much, but it costs. The electricity, the hot water, the towels, they're not provided by gym fairies. They're provided by taxpayers. You know, and the same is true for countless facilities across America, closed by the senseless Republican shutdown. In fact, since we've decided that we're going to pay all the employees when it's over, we're paying them not to work, and it's costly not to collect fees, you can make a better argument for restoring those services than you can for the House Gym. Some of the most fanatic about inflicting unnecessary pain on the American public are regulars, enjoying our House Gym while the staff gym is closed. Mr. Speaker, if you and the House Republicans are serious and not cynical about the shutdown, then shut down the House Gym until this madness ends.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As like myself and many Americans, I'm very frustrated over the inaction of Congress to be able to get this work done. But let's look back for what's happened in the last week or so. The House Republicans, we've sent bills over to the Democratic-controlled Senate to open the government, to run the government, to fund the government. We've sent, starting from delaying Obamacare, which most Americans have serious problems with, to other bills, and I want to talk about the latter two ones that we sent. One was just to fund the government completely till December 15th, but also with two exceptions. The one exception is that members of Congress will have, and the President would live by the same rules under Obamacare that all Americans have to do. The other exception is Obamacare, we need to live by those rules, and let's move on. The people that talk about the status quo in American history here, the status quo, if you vote for a clean CR, you want the status quo to remain the same. That means unemployment stays where it is, force Americans into part-time work. We need structural changes to underlying problems. We need to address why our debt keeps going up. You know, the President yesterday in his news conference talked about raising the debt ceiling doesn't increase the debt ceiling, doesn't increase spending. Well, I wish the President would answer to me. When he took office, the debt was $10 trillion. Now it's approaching $17 trillion. How does not raising the debt ceiling not increase the debt? You know, we talk about, the President talks about it's unprecedented that talking about the debt ceiling and having negotiations would be unprecedented if we do that. Well, Ronald Reagan and Speaker Tip O'Neill did it. Bill Clinton did it. President Obama did it in 2011 in the Budget Control Act. It's not unprecedented. And interestingly, the time the President has been forced to negotiate is times when we've had crisis where we've had to address. And the President did that in 2011. If Obamacare is so good and it's a President's signature piece of legislation, he ought to be the first one to sign up for it. I believe the first family ought to be first in line to sign up for Obamacare. But you know what? The President of the United States is exempt from Obamacare. Doesn't make sense. He ought to have to live by his own bills that he supported and pressed through. You know, I talk about compromise. I'm sure the President doesn't watch Fox News, but I think Bill O'Reilly's got a compromise that maybe makes some sense. The individual mandate. You know, that was one of the things we put in there to say in one of those bills. We said, delay the individual mandate for 1 year. The President delayed the employer mandate for 1 year. It only makes sense, especially when you see so many people having trouble signing up, getting on, and all the uncertainty. We're getting reports now of premiums going through the roof, higher deductibles, higher copays. And, you know, we need to delay. One of the bills we said in the bill was to delay the individual mandate for 1 year. That was rejected by the Senate. And then also we sent a bill over there to say, okay, if you don't take that, let's just go to conference. Let's sit down and talk. Let's negotiate. But I think the compromise Bill O'Reilly puts out on Fox News the other night makes some sense. Make the individual mandate voluntary. But don't force people to go on this. Delay it for 1 year. Don't force people to go on this and risk their privacy concerns, force them to pay higher insurance premiums for insurance they may not need. Let's see what happens. And Obamacare moves through, but I think that's a compromise that makes some sense, and the President ought to look at that and talk about that. But in order to do that, he needs to come to the table. He needs to sit down with House Republicans and negotiate and work through the problems. That's how our system of government was set up, and that's how it's supposed to work. The founders had that right, especially in divided government. So I encourage the President. Now, this morning there's some reports that the President is inviting the House Senate Democrats to the White House later today, and supposedly we're going to get an invitation here soon. That's encouraging. I hope he's serious about sitting down and working out the differences, because we have to get back to the work of the American people expect us to do. And so I look forward to sitting down with the President and our leadership and work through these problems and get the government going. But we can't do it without sitting down and talking and making sense and represent the American people, because we were elected to do that. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wilson, for 5 minutes. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, it has been more than 1,000 days since I arrived in Congress, and Republican leaders have still not allowed a single vote on serious legislation to address our jobs crisis. Instead, this House has voted 46 times to defund or delay health care for people who desperately need it, wasting precious time. Wake up, Republicans! Obamacare is not only the law of the land, it's not only a safeguard to save the millions of people with pre-existing conditions, it is an essential tool to give people the economic security and purchasing power they need to revive our economy. People need Obamacare. President Obama cares about the American people, and we should too. Even a Tea Party member of my freshman class of 2010 understood this when he stood and expressed his hopes of being able to receive federally subsidized health coverage immediately upon taking office. He was incensed. He couldn't wait 30 days, but he acts like as if he wants his constituents to wait forever. People all over the world are amazed that we do not have universal health care like they do. We are the world power, and they're saying, you don't have universal health care in America? Mr. Speaker, people want health care. People deserve health care. And, Mr. Speaker, people want jobs. No one wants to revive the Great Recession by playing dangerous games with our economy. But you know what? That's precisely what this House is doing. This is scary. I'm nervous. I'm stunned by the insensitivity. The whole world economy rests on America's Treasury bonds. Let me repeat. The whole world economy rests on America's Treasury bonds. Mr. Speaker, when we play with fire on the debt ceiling, you threaten to burn down the buttress on which Americans' 401ks, mutual funds, small businesses, and stock portfolios rest. Just consider what happened the last time Republicans simply threatened to breach the debt ceiling in 2011. Government bonds were downgraded, retirement assets plummeted, and homeowners saw big hikes in their monthly payments. That was just for talking about breaching the debt ceiling. Independent analysts have concluded that a debt default would be as bad as the global financial crisis of 2008. After that crisis, American savers lost decades worth of wealth in their homes and 401ks. We are still living with massive unemployment from that crisis to this day. While some members of Congress may like to behave as though we've moved past our unemployment crisis, it's a different story when you look at African Americans. 13% unemployment. The Hispanic community, 9.3% unemployment. And the youngest workers, 22% unemployment. Across America, there are nearly 12 million people officially out of work and tens of millions more who are underemployed or who have simply given up looking. America's public sector workers are teachers, firefighters, construction workers, public health workers, medical researchers, public defenders, bus drivers, social workers, and police have already suffered so painfully. First, under the sequester, and now under the shutdown. But a default would devastate every worker and every retiree. It would hit every 401k, every mutual fund, every stock portfolio, every mortgage payment, and every student loan, and every business loan. It's impossible to be physically conservative or pro-business. It's time for Congress to pass a clean debt ceiling bill. Mr. Speaker, open the government. Mr. Speaker, raise the debt ceiling. Mr. Speaker, let's begin to address our real crisis.
Ladies, time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I have been listening to both sides in this very important debate, the future of America and where we're going and how we're going to pay for the future of this country. What is amazing to me is that President Karzai of Afghanistan, I don't believe he's furloughed one person. We're furloughing U.S. government workers all across this nation, but Mr. Karzai continues to get his millions and millions of dollars. Mr. Speaker, this is unnecessary. I don't know why we in Congress continue to fund a war where we can't even get an accountability from the inspectors. It makes no sense. I want to read 3 paragraphs from an article I read this weekend called The Forgotten War. One of the paragraphs, and I quote, "But even when the war ends and Americans have forgotten it altogether, it won't be over in Afghanistan. Obama and Karzai continue negotiating toward a bilateral strategic agreement to allow the United States to keep at least 9 of the biggest bases it built and several thousand trainers and undoubtedly special operations forces in Afghanistan, seemingly forever." Another of the paragraphs, "It won't be over in the United States either. For American soldiers who took part in it and returned with catastrophic physical and mental injuries, and for their families. The battles are just beginning. For American taxpayers, the war will continue at least until mid-century. Think of all the families of the dead soldiers to be compensated for their losses, all the wounded with their health care bills, all the brain-damaged veterans at the VA hospitals. Think of the outgoing costs of their drugs and prosthetics and benefits. Medical and disability costs alone are projected to reach $754 billion, not to mention the hefty retirement pay of all those generals who issued all those reports of progress as they so ambitiously fought more than one war leading nowhere. Mr. Speaker, just this past weekend, we had 5 Americans brought back in flag-draped coffins. I doubt sincerely if many people in this country read that report, that 5 Americans came back in a flag-draped coffin. I do not understand why this Congress continues to have these difficulties of trying to fix our own problems in this country, but don't worry about the waste, fraud, and abuse, and more important, the loss of limb and body and heart that our kids have been given in Afghanistan. I will close by reading one more paragraph from the article called The Forgotten War. Will the United States still be meddling in Afghanistan 30 years from now? If history is any guide, the answer is yes. And if history is any guide, 3 decades from now, most Americans will have only the haziest ideas of why. I can only say to the families of those 5 patriots who came back in a flag-draped coffin, may we never forget, that the war in Afghanistan continues to go on, and probably will for the next 30 years. Come on, Congress, let's get together. Let's stop spending money in Afghanistan. More important, let's stop sending our young men and women to give their limbs and their life. And Mr. Speaker, in closing, as I always do, I ask God to please bless our men and women in uniform. I ask God to please bless the families of our men and women in uniform. I ask God in His loving arms to hold the families who've given a child dying for freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq. I ask God to bless us in the House and Senate. Bless the President. And please, God, 3 times, God, please, God, please, God, please continue to bless America, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Bustos, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House, please.
Yes, without objection, so ordered.
Great. Thank you, sir. I rise today to once again speak out about the human consequences and the reckless and irresponsible government shutdown. Today, it's day 9 into this needless swirl of frustration and madness. Yesterday, I spent time on the telephone talking with a woman who I am here to represent. She lives in a small town called Roseville, Illinois. It's in the southern part of my congressional district. Her name is CHERI Leith. And CHERI is a decade-long employee of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and she serves as a food inspector. She spent the first 4 years of her employment in the slaughterhouse, a beef slaughterhouse. The last 6 years, she's in the inspection area of a poultry and a pork processing plant. This is not a glamorous job. She's the first to admit that. But she works very hard every day, and she takes great pride in the fact that she is making sure that our food is safe and wholesome. She has 4 children and 6 grandchildren, and she says she keeps them in mind, and she keeps all the children in mind throughout this country as she's inspecting these plants and make sure, again, that this meat goes out safe and wholesome. So today, she'll drive. She has a very long commute. She'll spend most of that time in a cooler that's at most 45 degrees. And I would call someone like CHERI Leith an unsung hero. Because without people like CHERI, who, again, are not receiving their pay right now, our food supply would be in jeopardy. So she's going into work every day, not taking home a paycheck, and she is worried at a deep level about her family's future. She has a husband named Thomas who is a school bus driver and brings home $800 a month. This is not enough for Cheri and Thomas Leith to pay their bills. So they've already discussed what this government shutdown means to their family. Step one for them, if the paycheck doesn't come, is they will tap into their reserves, into their savings. Step two, if it leads to that, they will have to go into further credit card debt. This is not what we should be doing to people like Cheri and Thomas Leith. This is not what we should be doing to the hardworking federal employees who want nothing more than to do a good job, go to work, and receive fair pay. But this is the way it's been for 9 days now. We heard our Congressman Steny Hoyer speak a half an hour ago now, talking about that we have an answer to this right now. We have enough Republican votes and we have enough Democratic votes today, within the hour, as he explained it, to get the government up and running again. We could immediately, today, provide relief for people like Cheri and Thomas Leith by reopening the government right here and right now. We have a bipartisan path to do that. I would say let's do it, let's get at it today and put these good, hardworking people back to work and receiving a fair pay. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the fact that we are here today to debate raising America's debt limit is a sign of leadership failure. It is a sign that the United States government cannot pay its debts. It is a sign that we now depend on ongoing financial assistance from foreign countries to finance our government's reckless fiscal policies. That was a statement by Senator Barack Obama in 2008. Driving up our national debt from $5 trillion to $9 trillion is irresponsible. It is unpatriotic. Once again, Senator Barack Obama. Increasing America's debt weakens us domestically and internationally. Leadership means that the buck stops here. Instead, Washington is shifting the burden of bad choices onto the backs of our children and our grandchildren. America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership. Americans deserve better. I therefore intend to oppose the effort to increase America's debt limit. Senator Barack Obama, 2006. But that was then. This is now. The President last week said without an increase in the borrowing limit, the whole world will have problems. In other words, we're all going to die. The sky's going to fall unless the United States raises the debt limit. Seems to be a little bit inconsistent on positions regarding the debt limit. Of course, now the debt limit is up to $17 trillion, doubled what he talked about several years ago of not raising. So we find ourselves in a situation where the President's attitude seems to be, I will not negotiate, except with the Russians, the Syrians, the Iranians about what's going on overseas, but I will not negotiate, I will not talk to the House of Representatives about American issues. It would seem to me, Mr. Speaker, that things that are happening in the United States are really just as important as what's happening in Russia, Syria, and Iran, but maybe not to the administration. The administration rather being shut down and locked down for political reasons than to talk, negotiate, to compromise, to even listen. You know, Mr. Speaker, they say that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. It seems the administration is in bunker mentality while the United States is in economic turmoil. And where are we? we are in a situation where there is no talking. And it seems to be, the administration says, it's our fault the President won't talk to us. The President has a habit, it seems, to blame others on bad things that happen, and takes credit for things that are always good. But in any event, so I reemphasize the President's own words about why we should not raise the debt limit. It is reckless. It is irresponsible. It is unpatriotic. It hurts us domestically and internationally. It's a failure of leadership, and Americans deserve better. I agree with that. So, since the President seems to be somewhat inconsistent about his positions, why doesn't he just talk to us? Talk to us about the debt limit, the continuing resolution, about America's issues, America's policies, America's problems, and at least acknowledge that the House of Representatives exists. So I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, when you get to talk to the President, because I don't get to talk to him, that he would come out of the White House and meet with the People's House and quit fiddling around and start talking to us so we can solve this problem together. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. KAPTUR, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the majority party's latest idea is to create a super committee to figure out how to reverse their Republican shutdown of government. Frankly, Congress doesn't need another committee. It only needs the Speaker to unlock the Tea Party chains put on regular committee order and function in this House. Let the Appropriations Committee do its job as mandated by our Constitution. It can and will get the job done. Though it is not my first preference, we can begin by allowing a vote on a clean, continuing resolution, that is, allowing the Senate bill, which contains the Republican budget mark of $986 billion, to move forward. Though the Democrats have expressed deep dismay at that number, as it is not what Democrats had sought in discretionary accounts, it speaks loudly to which party is willing to compromise. And then if the majority party does not like the Affordable Care Act, use your real power in the regular committee structure that you control to change it. But closing down the entire government is a sledgehammer when what you need is merely a needle and thread. Meanwhile, the Republican shutdown is wreaking havoc on our economy. More and more working Americans and businesses are getting singed. How can this be good? The Republican shutdown costs the American people $12.5 million each hour and $300 million a day. As of today, the GOP shutdown has already cost the American taxpayers over $2 billion. Is that responsible government? The Republican shutdown has caused rising uncertainty about our economy. It has already placed a downdraft on our economic markets and job creation. Yesterday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell another 160 points. This is part of a recent precipitous slide which has seen the financial market lose nearly 400 points this month alone. Overall, the trend is strongly in the wrong direction, down. The International Monetary Fund, as a result of the Republican shutdown, cut its growth forecast for our economy by 0.3 percentage points to 2.9% for this year and 3.6% for next year. This surely will cost the American economy more jobs going forward. The sapping of U.S. growth will be felt globally as U.S. economic sluggishness impacts other nations. Global markets continue to fall as well, wondering what will happen to the value of our Treasury bonds. Chaos and uncertainty trigger poor markets. We sure don't need any more of that medicine. There are over 800,000 federal workers who have been furloughed as a direct result of the shutdown. They're worrying about whether they can pay their bills, pay their mortgage. NASA, for example, had to furlough 97% of its more than 18,000-person workforce due to the closing of the government. At NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, only 100 of 3,150 civil servants have not been furloughed. An additional 10,000 contractors with the Johnson Space Center will face being furloughed. According to a local Fox affiliate, the NASA Gland Research Center in Brook Park, Ohio, near Cleveland, which I represent, has essentially furloughed nearly all its 3,000 employees at NASA's Key Propulsion Center. This absolutely punches down the local economy as well as national. The Republican shutdown has also caused many more contractors who do detailed work for our government to lose their jobs. Defense contractors like Boeing and Lockheed Martin have had to furlough thousands of employees because the shutdown has halted awards and payments to those companies. The Republican shutdown hurts government agencies and weakens our national security. There are currently no death benefits given to families of soldiers killed in action. Medical treatment for those in the military has been scaled back, and furloughs are creating backlogs for VA disability claims. Mr. Speaker, just bring the clean continuing resolution that has the Republican budget number in it to a vote. Reopen our government. Use the regular committees to work out any difficulties you have with the Affordable Care Act. And please, put America's economy back on an even keel. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my remaining time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce, for 5 minutes.
Speaker, request unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Gentleman's recognized.
Words are very powerful, and words are important. I hear the words from our President and realize that he understands the importance of words also. In the past, he's talked about debt, borrowing, and spending, but now he talks about obligations because he understands that debt to the American public is a four-letter word. He doesn't want to be tagged with the fact he's asking for more debt. So now it's obligations. That's a word that has cleaned up the concept that we're simply borrowing against our future. But even the word borrowing needs to be looked at, because that assumes that we have the credit to borrow with. And the truth is, no nation can lend us the kind of deficits that we're running right now, so we're actually printing the money. But even the word printing has been changed in Washington. Now it's quantitative easing. It just sounds so much better. Printing sounds so crass to the American public, who might be worried about what's happening to their savings accounts while Washington is printing money. The word negotiation is a word that the President is familiar with. He did it 2 years ago when we reached this exact same point. Both sides came to the table, they negotiated, and we wound up with a budget that was not as extremely overdrawn as we had faced before. That's the power of negotiations. But now the word negotiation is taken out of the President's vocabulary, and he declares that he's being held hostage. Oh, really? This thing he calls being held hostage is actually the American way. It's what our founding fathers wanted. They came here and set up a system with a president and two houses of Congress and two different parties. And those parties would sometimes have all the power, and sometimes they would share the power. This president says he's being held hostage by the system. That means he doesn't believe in the balance of powers that the electorate cast in the last election. He declares over and over that the election is done, I was elected. The same people that elected him chose to put Republicans in power in the House of Representatives. I think they did that because they were afraid of this debt, deficit, borrowing, and spending. We're told that we should have a clean CR. There's nothing clean about sacrificing the future of our children and grandchildren. That's what the President wants, a CR where he can spend what he wants to spend without negotiations on anything. We actually in the House submitted 4 different plans before this shutdown occurred. Those plans were just summarily rejected by the Senate, waved off, not really even considered. And yet, we find our friends declaring this to be the Republican shutdown. Not that both houses failed to come to an agreement and the White House failed to sit down and negotiate. They just weren't going to be held hostage. So now then we need a clean CR, according to some, and we need to stop this Republican shutdown. Words are very powerful. No longer do we talk about spending in Washington. We talk about investing. We're investing the Americans' public's money. We're investing it in things like studies of the sexual habits of the fruit fly in Tijuana or wherever. Debt is indeed a four-letter word. We're finally led to believe that default will occur immediately, that we somehow won't pay our obligations. But the American people need to understand that they are still paying their taxes every day, and those taxes come to Washington. That's about $2.5 trillion a year. If we do not extend the debt ceiling any higher, then what Washington is going to have to do is it's going to have to prioritize. It's going to decide which of its expenses to pay. The Constitution demands that we pay our obligations. It says we can't default on those. Washington would have to do the same thing every American family does. It will have to prioritize its expenses if we do not extend the debt ceiling. So chaos will not reign. We simply have to live within our means. That's what every American family has to do. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Let me first of all say good morning to my colleagues and start with a thank you to President Obama for his invitation to the White House to all members of Congress in quite a contrast to the representations of the President's lack of involvement. In fact, over the last 4 or 5 years, this Congress has failed to pass a budget with a Republican majority in the House that has constantly raised the questions of how can we stop growth in America. So I thank the President, first of all, for his negotiating at the beginning of January 2013 in the tax negotiation, along with the acceptance of the very structured and restrictive and non-growth number of 986 for the budgeting of this particular nation. We're a growing nation. We're a thriving nation. We're the most powerful nation in the world, and the way to go forward is to invest in America's people. So I thank the President. I thank the President for recognizing, as devastating as the sequester was, that he was willing to cede to a super committee that did not fulfill its responsibilities. And so we are here, and this is not about individual members of Congress. It is about the American people. It is about the 29-year employee in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that spoke eloquently to the fact that, combined with military service, she desired to be at work. She enjoyed working with her young child and being at a school, but she wanted to be able to help Americans. But she's not able to go to work. It speaks to this question of the willy-nilly structure that the Republicans have constructed. I use the term martial law. For those who want to understand it better, we were speaking of the martial rule. So it's martial law on this floor. But a martial rule that we're using means that whatever is thrown down on the floor, whatever Legos is thrown down on the floor to be picked up, that's how we're running this government. And so the words clean bill is not a naughty word. It means that we want to fulfill the ability to fund the entire government, not to leave out the SNAP and WIC program or school food programs that are suffering, not to leave out rural development or Commodity Future Training Commission, Centers for Disease Control that announced today that there's a salmonella epidemic. And because we don't have those staff persons, America suffers. And I understand Senator McCain's frustration on the floor of the United States Senate, because I went to the floor yesterday in the early morning hours to express my pain for the families who have lost their loved ones in Afghanistan, their young men and young women, and to be able to be told because of our government shutdown that their memorial services benefits could not be had. And I planned the introduction of a bill, ceded to the bill that is now going to be on the floor, that now we're going to pick to be able to help them. I indicated yesterday in a letter to the Secretary that he should immediately provide them with their funds, that it was eligible under a particular law, because we all come together around that issue. We are pained because of the loss of those loved ones, of those family members. And so, Mr. Speaker, this is not about us. And I continue to say that we are not doing it the right way, because my Vietnam veteran in Houston, Mr. Simons, Richard Simons, who came to a veterans center, was turned away yesterday. Homeless veterans in Houston who need the veteran service centers are being turned away as of Wednesday because all of these veterans centers are being closed down. The farmer in Iowa, John Gilbert, has 770 acres. He's working every day, but he can't get his agricultural resources because the Department of Agriculture is shut down. A family resource center that's dealing with domestic violence is no more because they cannot get their federal dollars. And then, of course, the U.S. Attorney's Office is seeing 4,000 U.S. attorneys shut down, 3,000 Lockheed employees laid off, 3,000 NASA employees laid off. And so I believe that it is important that we recognize that we are not here for ourselves. We're here for the families whose loved ones laid down their life in Afghanistan. And whether we call it a clean bill, however we call it, it needs to be put on the floor of the House, because we cannot run the government by playing Legos. We can't throw sticks down on the ground. We can't be out on the corner playing those games, throwing things on the ground and saying whatever happens, it will happen. We've got to help Richard Simons. We've got to help the veterans going to these closed centers. And we've got to make sure that we understand that a president should be judged for his leadership in this country and not on where he came from, what he looks like. We have to be able to work with all people in America, and all the people are being harmed. Mr. Speaker, I ask this one question as I go to my seat.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Are we going to leave home